This is the original Australian Constitution, and on special occasions the National Archives of Australia put it on display. Can you see the date? July 1900, though it was of course officially adopted in January 1901. It's such an important document. It was designed to bring the colonies together as states of Australia and to provide a system of governance and lawmaking by the people for the people. Still under England, yes, but we, the people of Australia, now make our own laws in our own country. 151 parliamentary members, each representing one geographic area of Australia, elected by, will listen to and represent their constituents when constructing laws. This is the way it will be done. Australians now have a voice. Well, that is, if your parliamentary member is prepared to listen to you, and sadly it has become evident over the last couple of 100 years that certain groups have struggled to be heard. Laws have been made which have impacted on minority groups who have not been adequately consulted or included in the process. In this regard, our first Australians, the people who have called Australia home not just since 1901, but arguably for 60,000 years, have suffered the most. For the most part, they have not had a voice in Parliament. They have not been adequately consulted when many laws were made that affected them. They haven't even been acknowledged in the most important document we have. So, the question to be put to the Australian people very soon now will be a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Sadly though, this has not received bipartisan support. Probably not that surprising. Whoever is in opposition seems to oppose the government of the day as a matter of course. To be fair though, some brave souls like Julie and Lisa have been brave enough to cross the floor. But what is really surprising is that some Christians are not supportive of this either. And it is to them I want to speak to today. So let's begin by reminding ourselves of what God expects of us concerning social justice, dealing with minority and marginalised groups, and basically listening to people. Listening to the voices of the ignored or the marginalised was something that set Jesus apart from both the Romans and the Jewish leadership. There were numerous occasions when Jesus stopped to listen to those who were pushed to the margins. In Luke 10, a lawyer asked Jesus what he needed to do in order to fulfill the law. And Jesus famously answers, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself." Luke 10, verse 27. When the lawyer asked, "Who is my neighbour?" Jesus answered with the story of the Good Samaritan. Now we all know that famous story, right? A Jewish man left to die on the side of a road. Everyone walks past him except for the Samaritan. That parable was more than just a story about being kind. That was a story with significant implications for his followers. His followers should treat all people well, especially those people who are marginalised, often held in disdain and often ignored. When the disciples saw children as a nuisance to be avoided, Jesus saw them as a treasure to be welcomed, to be received, and to be listened to. Remember what Jesus said to the disciples? Let the children come. In first century Palestine, there was a lot of prejudice directed to minority groups. such as women, foreigners, the disease, and more. They were to be avoided, even cast out at times. But Jesus did things differently. He sat with the woman at the well. He interacted with Mary when she poured perfume on his feet. And when he healed the woman with the bleeding disorder, he called her daughter, a term of unmistakable endearment. Jesus touched lepers. He shared a meal with Zacchaeus, a vile tax collector, a traitor even. Jesus went out of his way to listen to the minority and the marginalised. Now, this was revolutionary, but it shouldn't have been, because the Old Testament prophets had been speaking about kindness and justice for centuries. Jeremiah 22 verse 3, for example, "Thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness and deliver from the hand of the oppressors him who has been robbed, and do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless and the widow." And Micah 6 verse 8, "He has told you what is good and what the Lord requires of you. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God." And Proverbs 31 verse 9, "Defend the rights of the poor and needy." In Isaiah 1 verse 17, "Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." And on it goes. God demanded of Israel to actively seek justice for the marginalised and to address corruption and oppression. And God has not changed. This is why we need to do more for our first Australians. This is why they should be singled out above all others for a special mention in the Constitution and to be given a voice at the table when laws are proposed concerning them, because their land was taken unjustly and they have been mistreated for far too long. Even though it was our ancestors who committed the crimes, we need to do all we can to address that which our ancestors have done. After all, we are the beneficiaries of their crime. In 1770, Captain James Cook landed in Botany Bay, home of the Aurora people, and claimed possession of the east coast of Australia for Britain under the doctrine of terra nullius, which meant land that is legally deemed to be uninhabited. In the late 18th century, there were legally three ways that Britain could take possession of another country: if the country was uninhabited, if the country was already inhabited, Britain could ask for permission from the indigenous people, or they could purchase the land, but they could not steal the land. If the country was inhabited, Britain could take over the country by invasion and conquest. In other words, defeat the country in war. However, even after winning a war, Britain was obligated to respect the rights of the indigenous people. After the next 250 plus years, people have defaulted to one or all of these positions, but whatever justification used, it is clear the taking of their land, the process used, and the subsequent treatment of has mostly been illegal and unjust, in both a worldly measure and a godly measure. And it has been unjust. 250 years have passed since Captain Cook declared Australia as terra nullius, and 26 million people later, it is impossible to wind back the clock. It is impossible to undo the sins of our forefathers. But we can at least make steps today which are right and good, which in some way acknowledge that which has been done, and in small and large ways work towards better relations with the people who have been wronged. And this is why it is important to acknowledge our First Nation people in the most important national document we have, the Constitution. Now, it won't solve all their problems, but it is a foundational step. Something that probably should have been done in 1901, but better late than never now. Worldwide, the US, Canada and New Zealand have all moved to recognise Aboriginal people in their respective constitutions. The United States government has more than 350 treaties with Native Americans. Norway's constitution recognises the country as bicultural, but in the Australian constitution there is no acknowledgement at all of First Nation people. In fact, journalist Jeff McMullen says it is one of the few constitutions in the world today with negative race powers allowing governments to make laws and policies that pointedly trample the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Aboriginal Anglican Bishop Chris McLeod says most decisions in the history of Australia have been made for First Nation people rather than with First Nation people. A new chapter in the Constitution, for that's probably what it will be an acknowledgement that the First Nations people exist, and when new laws are proposed, they'll be consulted. It has been interesting to listen to the arguments for a no vote. All sorts of people have concerns and fears, but I found that with a bit of conversation and sometimes a bit of fact checking as well, most people's fears can be allayed. I spoke with one person who said too much power will be given to them. Well, actually no, the Constitution does not give them any power or power of veto or make any undue or onerous commitment other than that they will have a voice. Another person said that means it's useless, so why bother? Well, actually no, this is an important and foundational law in the most important national document we have. Not just any law which can be easily changed with a new government, but a constitutional law. In recent interviews, Jeff Kennett said that he wants to see a statement of acknowledgement in the Constitution, but doesn't want any commitment to a voice. He says the Constitution should be for all Australians equally, and it shouldn't be racially based. The problem with this is that our First Nation people are not like any other immigrant. Over the years, many cultures have immigrated to Australia. Italians, Greeks, Indians, Chinese, Vietnamese, Lebanese and more, all of whom have immigrated in great numbers and on occasions experienced some level of racial abuse. However, the original and Indigenous people never chose to come here. They were already here, and they deserve more than to be lumbered in the racially marginalised group. I guess it's a little like this. If you had a house which you and your family have owned for generations, and then someone forcefully moves into your house and starts inviting all their friends to move into, you would object, right? And you would say, hey, this is my home. But then imagine if you are told you're nobody special, you're only one voice, so get back in the pack. I believe God expects us to do more for the Indigenous people of Australia, whose land was taken from them. I think God expects us to acknowledge them as the first and acknowledge that their land was taken from them and that they will in the future be given the respect they deserve and a voice. It isn't possible to turn back the clock, but it is possible to write a new chapter in the Constitution and to begin to build on that. Last week was NAIDOC week in my area of the Shellhaven. Hundreds, maybe thousands turned out. There was a lot of First Nation people, and wow, what a great vibe there was down there. Interestingly, though, there was no stall for the voice and very little talk about it. It's as if many First Nation people are so jaded and so disillusioned, it's hard to convince them that we really do value them. And this is going to get up. And if this referendum does get up, hopefully they'll begin to see that, wow, they do care for us. They do value us enough to put us in the Constitution. I heard one person say, it won't put food on the table or shoes on my kids' feet. Well, I would say to that, you're right, it's not going to do that. It's not a law designed to do that. It's designed to lay a foundation whereby future laws will do that. And those laws won't be foisted upon you. You'll be respectfully included in the process. Recently, Lydia Thorpe left the Greens Party to pursue a more active push for treaty. She hasn't revealed how she will vote concerning the voice, but previously she said that she would oppose it unless she was satisfied that it guarantees First Nations sovereignty is not ceded. Now, changing the Constitution to acknowledge First Nations and giving them a voice will not rule out the possibility of any future treaty or treaties. There's no underhanded thing here happening. So many of our First Nations peoples are suspicious of what is being done. And I guess, hey, we don't have a very good track record on that, right? But this, I believe, is a genuine step towards truth and justice. Something that they will appreciate, and I know they're looking for. They're looking for truth and they're looking for justice. Constitutional recognition is something we need to do as a matter of decency and respect. It's a foundation that should have been laid in 1901, and here it is 2023. Nevertheless, it's a foundation that needs to be laid because, as we all know, nothing great can be built until a good foundation is laid first.